Afternoon. My name's Caitlin. I'm just getting everything set up here, so you should see me. Hello. Wanted to get started here right on time. And I know we have quite a few people joining us live. A couple quick things before we get into the content. I believe everyone should be able to see my slides and see me. Also, if you do have any questions, you can type that into the questions box. So on GoToWebinar, you'll just see a little over on your interface where you can click on questions, type those in. The way that it works in GoToWebinar is that when you type in a question, I will see those coming through in the questions box, but other people don't see them. So I may not be able to get to everyone's questions as they come through, but if I am able to get to a question and answer it, I'm not going to say who asked it. I'm just going to say somebody asked and then summarize that question. So GoToWebinar kind of defaults to anonymity, and so that's how that works. So if you notice me kind of glancing over, I'm just keeping an eye on the questions in case anything's coming through. Again, I'll try to get to as many as I can. And we'll have time at the end for that. But if a question comes up during the content, you can also feel free to type that in. You don't have to wait till the end. You can also get a PDF version of this entire slide deck under that little handouts link right on the GoToWebinar interface. So if you click on that little arrow next to handouts, you'll see that you can download that PDF if you would like that. One of the last slides has a lot of resources on it, and so a lot of times it's helpful for folks to get that slide deck. And after this presentation, my team will be sending out attendance certificates for folks who attended the live version of it today. Okay. I think that that's pretty much our housekeeping for now. I know folks are kind of hopping on as we get started here. I wanted to, I think as we all know, and folks who signed up for this know what this training is about, I wanted to give you some brief background on my background specifically before we get into kind of an overview of how we're going through the content. And so my background, I'm with Canopy Employee Assistance Program. I started with Canopy about 10 years ago, almost 11 years ago, as a therapist. So my background is in clinical work. So I've worked with individuals, couples, families. My background specifically is in trauma psychology. I'm also a certified alcohol and drug counselor. I've worked in drug and alcohol treatment programs. I've worked in mental health outpatient programs. And so I started as a clinician, again, with Canopy, and now I'm the head of the training department with Canopy. So the way that that's kind of transitioned is that I've really moved into that consultation piece with organizations, primarily HR, talking about how to support employees' mental health, how to respond to potential mental health crises. So really kind of coming in from this perspective of kind of both sides of how to best address these circumstances as they come up. So I just wanted to kind of give that brief overview of my background before we get into the content. And my little, there we go, just moving over my GoToWebinar interface so I can see what I'm looking at. Okay, so wanted to just quickly go over how we're kind of going to categorize the next 45 minutes or so. So we won't go over time, I promise. So understanding some signs, symptoms, risk factors, what are ways that we specifically as HR are responding, and connecting with resources. So what that is going to look like is really that reminder that our role and the role of HR and the role of the individuals at the workplace that employees are coming to, this training is not teaching you how to be a therapist. So it is not HR's role to be anyone's clinical therapist, to diagnose anyone, to provide any type of therapeutic intervention. So I think sometimes it can be really challenging for folks in the workplace to try, especially HR, sometimes it's managers and then going to HR, about how to kind of balance that. We want to be supportive, we want to be empathetic, but then we are wanting to make sure we have really appropriate professional boundaries on what we can do and not do in terms of our role. And when I am talking to folks in HR, that's really one of the most common things I hear is, number one, I get really uncomfortable and I don't know how to respond. And then number two, I'm not really sure what to do or what my role is. So that's a lot of what I wanted to talk about today, to really mostly provide resources. No, you're not alone. You're not supposed to handle anything alone, that you're not expected or supposed to be someone's therapist. And, what are some kind of helpful things to remember, what to say and not say, what to do and not do. Okay. Ooh, there we go. So with this first one is a very common myth, is asking someone if they're thinking about suicide is dangerous because it can put the thought in their head. So that's a very common question I get is, I don't know if it's okay to ask someone, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Because I worry if I ask that, then that's going to put the idea in their head. That is a myth. So when we are looking at the actual fact, so asking someone about suicide is not going to lead them to contemplate something that they haven't thought of before. I would say, in my experience and my training, and when I'm doing trainings on this, this is one of the most common questions I get, or misconceptions. So if you are, spotting those indicators, someone might have be having suicidal thoughts, chances are high they've already thought about it. So again, you are not putting, anything into someone's mind. I'm going to quickly turn off just in case. I want to make sure that we're not being interrupted at all. Let's see. Okay. There we go. All right. Let's see here. I want to make sure that I think everyone should see my screen. When I look at, I just wanted to briefly check sounds like someone can only see the cover sheet, but from my view, it looks like people can see the slides. So I'm going to proceed on because on my end, it is showing that, okay, perfect. Other people can see the slides. Great. I'm going to proceed on. Okay. So when we're talking about warning signs, I think a lot of times of course I'm going to provide those maybe more like these direct warning signs. I think in the workplace, a lot of times we will also see indirect warning signs, and I'll definitely spend time talking about that too. So these direct warning signs, of course, are going to be more of those overt, specific comments, threats of suicide. So directly expressing a desire to hurt oneself, to kill oneself, a desire to die. You either hear them, overhear, or someone else says that someone has been talking about seeking access to means, writing about it. And it's interesting too, because with a lot of times folks are more connected to like colleague social media. And so there may be instances where a colleague says, hey, my coworker's social media posts are concerning me. And so we've seen more of that with some of that connection of potential social media posts. I'll give some examples of some indirect comments here too. And certainly after this, we're going to talk about like, what do I do? How do I kind of engage in this conversation? So I had already mentioned some of these. This third one, I think, can kind of, be in also that indirect category as well. Like everything would just be better off without me. That's a pretty common one that I think sometimes we hear. And then again, it's really, of course, challenging to know, like, how do I respond to this? And it can be very, very distressing. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is that, many people either directly or indirectly know someone, or they themselves have had previous thoughts of hurting themselves. Even going through a training like this can be re-triggering for some folks, can be very difficult. And I want to acknowledge that. I think what can be important for us to remember is that a lot of times what I hear from managers, from HR, from organizations is, I don't know how to talk about this, it's uncomfortable, and so I tend to avoid it. And that, I think, is really the piece we want to talk about, is not avoiding a conversation because we're uncomfortable having it. And that's different than becoming someone's therapist. But if you're concerned about someone's safety, we as HR, we as people in a leadership role at an organization have to have the skills to be comfortable enough to ask those direct questions. And I think the other piece too that I'll mention, so I don't forget later, is that when I'm talking to folks in HR, because as a Canopy, with Canopy EAP, we contract with hundreds of companies. So I'll talk to folks in HR with teeny tiny companies, with huge companies, and a lot of times, more often than I expect, I will talk to HR and they'll be like, I don't even know what our procedure is for this, or our policy is for this. Or HR is aware of what it is, but managers are not. And many times a manager is the first person who may be hearing this from an employee, and then they're going to HR. And so as an HR individual, it's really important to continuously educate leaders, managers, leadership about what the policy and procedure is, to make sure that they are trained appropriately on how to handle these things. So that's also, I think, a really important piece, because it's very often that they're kind of that first point of contact. And I hear a lot of leaders or managers saying, this was not part of my training when I got promoted, like the people management, certainly as it relates to something like this. So that is something I would encourage in terms of, like, beyond this training, making sure that leadership and leaders are well prepared and trained. The other thing I think is that sometimes there'll be one training and then it doesn't happen for a long time. It's like, oh, we did a training on that. These are types of topics I think they're important that at least like once a year, have a refresher course, make sure everybody has gone through that. It's really, really helpful. So some direct warning signs, or excuse me, some indirect warning signs. Some of these, of course, are going to be circumstances outside of the workplace, or things that, of course, another person can't immediately see. But sometimes substance use is changing. There's kind of this idea or feeling of hopelessness. Some things that you may notice more kind of directly behaviorally, if there's more like agitation, anxiety, a change in behavior. That's a big piece. It's like, this person was always super reliable and they're not anymore, or they've really been struggling on some of these projects, or they're, kind of just their outer appearance has changed. Sometimes it is, social isolation or withdrawal. Maybe they were really engaged with their colleagues and aren't really engaging with them anymore. So this, I think, is also really that notable piece of seeing the change in behavior, because there, of course, may be someone who's just more introverted, and they're not super engaged with their colleagues all the time. But if you're seeing someone's behavior change significantly, that is where, whether it's, could be mental health related, it could be signs that they are having suicidal thoughts. Again, you are not there to be a psychological assessor. But noticing the behavior changes, those measurable changes that you can see, is, I think, the really common one to be more aware of. Changes in mood. Sometimes they'll be asking, especially with like HR, they may be asking about certain policies or procedures, like what are the like insurance or life insurance policies. Like, say, they may be coming to you with some questions like that, some logistical questions that could be indicators, making arrangements, giving away items. So maybe at the workplace, they're giving away personal items. So those types of examples where they're a little bit more obvious to another individual. And I think sometimes when I'm talking to folks in the workplace, leadership or HR, they're like, am I supposed to be constantly hyperfixated on everyone's behaviors? Of course not. That's not possible. That's not your job. But it's just, if we are seeing a very significant change in behavior, and you notice that, or someone comes to you and says they notice that, And then it's that time where you can have that conversation with them. And of course, we will talk about how to do that. So some other indirect verbal cues, there's just no point in going on anymore. Do you think someone would take care of, insert this if something happened to me? Nothing's ever going to get better than this. There's nothing I can do. I also want to be thoughtful and remind folks, I think that we all know this, but I just want to verbally remind that if someone's saying, there's nothing I can do, I don't think anything's going to get better, that does not immediately mean they are having thoughts of suicide. These are potential verbal cues, and they can be potentially meaning that someone has or is currently having thoughts of suicide. So it's always remembering, everybody is unique and different. The symptoms, signs might look different. It's just noticing, kind of picking up on some of those cues as a sign for us to ask some questions, gather more information. And a lot of this, and I'll talk about this too as we go through, but I think it's important to mention this now, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is a lot of times when I'm talking to leaders or HR, so much of this is just, and understandably so, dealing with our own anxiety of like, I don't know what to say. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I'm wrong? All these kind of fears and anxiety, also just fearful of sitting with someone who might be emotional. And again, it's thinking, a lot of this starts with us being able to remain calm, to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And so, it was one thing that was interesting is a few years ago, we hired a counselor at Canopy who had previously been in HR. And she said that she was like, it felt like so much about what I was doing in HR felt like counseling. So I figured I might as well just become a counselor where I can. And so, there's a lot of that we're trying to find that balance. But it is really important to be able to sit with those, with uncomfortable emotions that may be coming up for us and stay calm. As someone on the EAP side, we have a 24/7 hotline, crisis line, and there will be times where, someone in HR may call us and I can tell they are spiraling, and are like, this is happening, you need to do that, and it's very understandable to be feeling really overwhelmed. It's thinking, okay, how can I calm myself down first so I can better connect this employee to resources and better support them? And I think a lot of times we talk about crisis intervention, supporting other people with mental health or suicidal thoughts, we get very focused on what do I say, what do I do? And honestly, before that, I always say, start with calming yourself down. And we have to learn how to regulate ourselves down so we can think more logically and help that person more effectively. When we are spiraling, when we are stressed, our logic brain goes offline. And so, then we're like, wait, what am I supposed to do? What happens next? And then we go into a panic as we are trying to help someone in distress, which isn't going to help anyone. So we'll talk more about some self-care strategies, but it's such a key component to being as effective as possible when we are trying to help someone. So another myth here is that, happy, successful people do not attempt suicide or have thoughts about it. Again, the actual fact, it can be very common to ignore warning signs, be like, there's no way that person's thinking that or feeling that, but there's no way to know. And so, again, not jumping to any conclusions, like not making assumptions, and remaining, as objective as possible when we are seeing any changes in behavior or concerning behaviors. Just checking my time. Okay, so some questions to ask. I know I had mentioned this earlier, but a lot of times when people are uncomfortable with these conversations, they kind of ask in all these really vague ways, but because they're afraid to just ask directly. It's actually really important to ask directly. So saying like, are you thinking of killing yourself? Or have you ever had those thoughts before? And this is where when we are talking to someone, so for example, at the workplace, if someone comes to you and says, or maybe a manager comes to you and says, an employee just came to me and said they're really struggling. They've made some comments that I'm concerned about their safety. Can you meet with them? And then what I would do as HR is first ask that manager some more information. What were some of those comments they made that were concerning to you? And maybe they're like, they said, I just don't see the point anymore. It doesn't even matter if I'm here. Kind of those maybe indirect comments. So as if they're like, can you talk to them? I'm, having them talk to you in terms of getting connected to resources. So for HR, I think that's where it's coming in with saying, hey, I know you spoke to so-and-so, whoever your manager is. I want to make sure that I'm here to support you. The way I'm here to do that is to gather some information, and do everything I can to connect you to resources. So you have that space that you're with them, and this may be in person, it may be a virtual meeting, and we can talk about, what to do in both of those situations, because you don't want the person to be left alone. In terms of HR, I would say that, making sure you know quickly how to access someone's emergency contact information, have that easily accessible on your end and ready to go. And then asking questions, say, hey, some of these comments, I just want to make sure, and I know your manager wants to make sure that you are supported, and we can do what we can to support you. Based on some of those things that you said, I do have some follow-up questions for you. Are you having thoughts of hurting yourself, of killing yourself? And so you're having that conversation with them in real time, but making sure to ask that directly. So I'm going to give some kind of do's and don'ts here after this, but we obviously, and I think HR is very aware of this, wanting to make sure we respect people's privacy. Sometimes what may happen is that an individual in the workplace may tell a colleague this information, and then they are telling you or telling a manager, and maybe later on they'll come to you and say, what happened? Are they okay? What's going on? And of course, probably in a very well-meaning way, but it's our job to respect people's privacy. So it's also important for HR to know how to respond if other individuals are like, what happened? Or I saw that they were upset and went and talked to so-and-so, and they made this comment in the lunchroom. And so how to have a statement of, it's wonderful to hear that you are, worried about your colleague and concerned about them. It is important that we respect everyone's privacy here. And so, that's, I can't, confirm or deny any updated information, but we can still, again, appreciate them caring and being curious, but while still maintaining that professional boundary. That active listening piece, and I'm going to go into some other examples of that as well. So this is kind of a quick overview slide. We're going to go in a little more detail. Some of these I've already shared. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? If they say yes, what I would say is, do you have a specific plan? Have you thought about how you would do that? Do you have the means? And so if they are physically at the workplace, it's really important to, have someone with them at all times. So try to not have them be by themselves. So if you have to step away to gather information or contact someone, see if there's another person, HR, another leader who can sit with them and stay with them. You can, ask them, would you be willing to talk to a counselor on the phone right now about how you're feeling? If so, I can, have you sit in here and I can step out. So in that case, we've had that happen where there's like a warm transfer. So there's someone in HR, they're in the office. Like, again, if this is like they're physically at the workplace, we'll have HR contact us and say, hey, I have this individual. They've shared that they're having some, suicidal thoughts, and they are willing to talk to a counselor right now, and give us some basic information, callback number name, callback number in case the call drops, and then, hand that phone over to the employee, and then they'll step out. So we have Canopy offers that. We're, again, a crisis line as well. So we have a 24/7 line. So that has happened sometimes. And they may say, I want you to have some space for privacy to talk to that person. And then at that time, you could be gathering information in terms of emergency contact, any other kind of policy procedural steps you need to do. If they say, no, I'm not willing to do that, then asking them, would you be comfortable, my job is to make sure you're safe. And so, I don't want to, leave you alone right now. I can, call your emergency contact. They can come get you, and kind of go through those logistical steps. One thing I think is important to remember is if the answer is anything but no, like a very specific no to your question of are you having thoughts of hurting yourself, you're going to have, again, want to, like I said, follow up with some of these a few more of these questions just to gather some info. It's not to become their therapist. It's not to diagnose them. It just helps with getting next steps. So it's important to remind someone, I'm here as a support to you. My job is to make sure that you get connected to resources. You are asking them about details and plans, asking those open-ended questions. So for example, maybe you have noticed some behavioral changes in someone and you're wanting to, bring them into your office or have a meeting just to check in with them. And this may, be before they've said anything specific, but you're just kind of picking up on some of these concerning, behavioral changes. So what I would suggest, instead of saying something like, hey, is everything going okay? Right, that's a closed-ended question. So that only will really ask someone to give a yes or a no. So, hey, is everything going okay? A lot of times what people will say is, yeah, everything's fine, even if it's not, because it's too much of a closed-ended question, like all good, and we aren't meaning to kind of shut down the conversation, but it is a closed-ended question. So we rarely get the information we're looking for or an honest answer. I don't mean that because someone's like intentionally trying to be dishonest. It's just not really asking an open-ended version of that. So open-ended questions of, hey, I've noticed you've been, had some, here are some changes I've noticed, whatever those behavioral kind of measurable examples are, the reason that you're bringing them in. And I wanted to make sure everything's going okay. How have things been going lately? And those types of open-ended questions. And it starts from a workplace specific example, again, because you're not their therapist. So that's where it can be talking about maybe a change of behavior at work, or they've suddenly been late more often, or some comments they've made at the workplace. These are specific behaviors you can speak to. What I try to really avoid is to say, you've seemed off lately, you seem depressed, you seem anxious, you seem like you're struggling. So you may think that, but what happens with those types of comments is, firstly, they're too vague. What does that mean? What does seem depressed mean? And also, you're not there to diagnose them. So I always encourage people to make sure to focus on the measurable examples. So instead of you seem depressed, say, hey, I've noticed you haven't, engaged in any of the, after meeting lunch activities the last few weeks. That's a specific example of why you personally, like internally, might be worried that they seem depressed. So asking open-ended questions that you're not just asking for a yes or no answer, and giving specific examples instead of, you seem, insert mental health diagnosis. So the other thing too is this is not done, in a vacuum. So if you have concerns about someone, this is why it's important on an HR side to know the policy and procedure. What do we do next? Most often, and I know, coming from an EAP, we talk about this all the time. That's exactly what we're here for, is if someone's like, I don't know what to do, and this person is struggling with suicidal thoughts or mental health concerns, that's what we can help with. And the example I gave earlier is one example of how we can support. So connecting yourself to resources and that other person. This last one here, I think, is just that reminder as well. When we get anxious and stressed, we are talking fast, we're moving fast, and that can just make us and the other person more anxious and stressed. So often it's, and I think we know this, but it's in some cases not as much what we're saying, it's just like the energy we're bringing. And that, again, is the most common thing I notice is when we are kind of brought in, the HR person or manager is just like spiraling. And so it's like helping them calm down so they can better help that person. So anything that you can do kind of on your own to kind of calm yourself down first. Sometimes what we will encourage people to remember is to not promise secrecy. Sometimes someone may say, well, I want to talk to you about it, but you have to promise not to tell anyone. And, I will say my job is to support you. If I have concerns about you or, anyone else here at any time, I do have to follow a procedure to make sure you're safe. I hope you know that I am here to support you, and I hope you feel comfortable being honest with me right now. Because that's the best way that I can get you connected to resources. The other piece too is if someone is talking to you or sharing with you that they're having thoughts, active or passive suicidal thoughts, it is absolutely not appropriate to have a moral debate with them or conversation with them or have some value debate. So the other thing that sometimes we don't realize we're doing is asking questions of folks that's indicating that we want them to say no. So for example, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? We don't want to use language like that. And so just remembering to ask directly and not kind of that passive way of, I really hope you say no to this. Talking down to people or patronizing them, you don't really mean that. I know it's been a stressful day. You may not be, I think you might just be upset. You're not thinking clearly right now. So avoiding any of those kinds of statements. Also, a common one I try to be thoughtful about is to not tell someone they should or shouldn't feel a certain way. So for example, someone may say, I'm so overwhelmed, nothing's working, I'm a failure at everything. And what we want to do, of course, is try to make them feel better. And so we'll say, oh my gosh, you shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't feel like you are a burden. A lot of times people say, I just feel like I'm a burden to everyone. You shouldn't feel that way. So it's very well-meaning to respond that way, but it's actually not helpful, because and I always ask people this, in trainings, is like, has anyone ever told you you shouldn't feel that way? Like, did that ever work? If it was only that simple, right? So the thing is that someone already feels that way. So telling them you shouldn't feel that way is not going to be helpful. And a lot of times it feels like we're being kind of invalidated. And that will sometimes shut someone down because there's really no way to respond to that. It's like, well, I do feel that way, but okay, I guess I shouldn't. And so instead of saying you should or shouldn't feel that way, I would say that sounds so exhausting and difficult. And it also is probably hard to share that. And I am glad that you felt comfortable sharing that with me. I can't imagine how that must feel. And I want to make sure that I can support you and get you connected to resources. And I know that I don't see you as a burden. And I care about you. There's ways to say that without saying you shouldn't feel that way, or no one thinks that, so being, thoughtful in terms of how we respond. And I think that's that balance of that response is not suddenly becoming their counselor. We can be compassionate. It's important to be compassionate, be empathetic, but it doesn't mean we're just handling it by ourselves and creating some immediate clinical intervention ourselves. That's not our job. But it is really important to create that kind of sort of safety bridge that, hopefully is not too kind of like, I don't know, I just thought of that in the moment, but it's like, how can you provide that initial empathetic, compassionate response while you get them connected to those resources? So that's just kind of one example of how I try to shift away from you shouldn't feel that way to a more compassionate response. So what to say and do, so using that empathy, a lot of this also is nonverbals. And I see this when we are feeling stressed or anxious, it's harder to be present with that person. So someone knows we're listening if we're actually making eye contact, if we are asking open-ended questions. It can feel very stressful and overwhelming, and so we're moving fast, we're trying to do all these different things, but just taking a moment, that's why it's really helpful to try to have a space that's quiet, that's private, that you can have that conversation. The other thing too that can really reduce the stress, reduce the overwhelm, is that from an HR side, have the resources readily available. So instead of thinking, oh my gosh, where is our number to the EAP? I can't remember where I'm supposed to get this information. And then you're scrambling to gather that in the moment. So as much as you can just quickly access those things, you already know where they are, you already have that pulled up, ready to go when needed, can reduce your anxiety and make that kind of a more smoother process of getting them connected. So being calm, being reassuring, like, I'm going to sit here and we are going to make sure we get, connected to a counselor, and I'm happy to provide that resource. One thing I will say is sometimes people will not be comfortable or willing talking to a counselor on the phone. If you're like, are you willing to, I want to call the EAP and get a counselor on the phone, are you willing to talk to them? Sometimes the person will say, I don't know, I'm not sure how that's going to be, I haven't done that before, like kind of, unsure about that, but a little bit reluctant. I have found that in those circumstances, if I offer, are you willing to text with someone, they will oftentimes be willing to at least do that. And so if you are worried, or if it feels like they're kind of on the fence about a phone call, make sure you have resources, and I will have those on the resource slide as well, that you have those available in case someone's more comfortable texting instead. So, connecting them, make sure that you're being sincere, that you're being present, that you're listening, all of those things. So some other helpful language that you can utilize. We've got, you're not alone. It's okay to ask others for help and support. Someone may say, I know you're busy and now, you're having to talk to me, and, I feel bad, burdening you with this or all that. It's like, I am happy to help you. That's what I'm here for. It's okay to ask others for help and support. You're not alone. So those types of reassuring statements can be really powerful. And that's why I think it's helpful to use I statements, like, I'm here to support you, and I want you to know that you're not alone, and it is absolutely okay to ask for help. That's what we're here for. It's okay to be feeling that feeling. So instead of saying like you shouldn't feel that way, say it's okay to feel that way. I hear you. That sounds so difficult to feel that way, and I want you to know that I care about you and want to make sure you're okay. Sometimes people say, I feel like I'm going crazy. It's like, you're not going crazy. I'm right here. What you're telling me is I'm understanding you, you're making sense, and I want to make sure I can get you connected to resources. And this last one, another example, like if they're saying like nothing feels like it matters anymore, there's just no point anymore. It's like, I know that it sounds like it feels pointless right now. And that can be kind of that helpful. Again, these are just bridge statements to get them connected to a counselor, someone, a mental health professional. But when you say like, I sounds like it feels this, it sounds like it feels pointless right now. And that kind of brings it back instead of like, it just always will be. I think a lot of times when a person is in that state, it's like, it's never going to change. It's always going to be this way. And I think it's also important not to say it'll get better, it's not going to be this way forever, because that can feel like too much of like a patronizing, placating statement. And we honestly don't know like if something in someone's life is going to change right away ever, and so it's also important not to make kind of statements that we actually can't truly back up. So what I try to do instead of like, it sounds like it feels so hopeless right now, and that can, just saying right now makes it more time sensitive instead of it's always this way. But I I truly believe this is something that I can get you connected to support that you can get through. I want to make sure that we can help you get through this. So that's a way of kind of bringing it to the present moment. Um, and, this is where it's also being mindful that we're not there to try to convince someone of anything, to get into this back and forth kind of moral debate. If they're like, yeah, but it just feels like forever right now, I'd be like, I hear you. Like it's not like, but you need to know it's only right. Like sometimes a person, and you're not a therapist, you have a brief conversation with them. So you do what you can and then connect them to someone who can assist them longer term. So it's just like, I hear you. And that sounds so difficult. And what I can do is make sure that you get connected to resources right now. So a couple things to be aware of if you notice yourself getting anxious during these conversations, to really slow down, calm your voice down. When I say slow down and calm down your voice, we don't want to be patronizing. We want to be like, are you okay? But just not going into that spiral. So sometimes what we will do when we're feeling anxious is we have a really tough time listening very well. So we go into kind of waiting to talk instead of actually listening. And what will happen during those times is we'll interrupt people. We will not hear them correctly. We're so kind of spiraled in our head. We're not even really present with that person. So sometimes what I try to do is I'm going to take one deep breath, kind of internally before I respond to this person. Or I'm going to count back 2 seconds or 3 seconds and then respond. Just give myself a moment to be present instead of super reactive. And that can help us, again, us think more logically and then, be able to respond more effectively. Sometimes managers or HR will say, is it appropriate to follow up with someone? Like maybe they take some time off or, we get them connected to a counselor to talk on the phone, their emergency contact picks them up and, and maybe they're off work that day or off work for a certain amount of time. Is it okay to check in with them when they're back? Absolutely. And so, when someone comes back to work, maybe they're off for a while, say, hey, I'm really glad that you're back. I wanted to just check in. Number one, just to check in on any logistical questions you have, any updates on your work tasks, kind of where things at, how I can support you in reintegrating and get you updated on those. If you need some extra time catching up on things. Also, is there anything else that I can help you with in terms of continued resources as it relates to EAP or anything else? So having that follow-up is really helpful. And I do sometimes get questions from HR if that is appropriate or not. So making that referral, after asking those questions and gathering those answers from them, if someone is providing passive suicidal thoughts, so they're not saying I'm thinking of killing themselves, just saying I'm feeling hopeless, and you're like, are you thinking of hurting yourself or killing yourself? And they say no. Of course, we may still be concerned about them. And so you can say, I wanted to make sure to check in with you. I appreciate that we had this conversation. I still want to provide you with resources in case you're ever interested in getting connected to, if you have an EAP, you can text them, you can email them, you can call them. That's what they're there for. You can also always come to me if you are having other concerns. If you do want to get additional resources, please let me know. So still, normalizing that they can come to you with anything that they may need connecting to resources about. And then referring out, that's similar to the example I'd given. So you can either call a crisis line if you don't have an EAP. If you have an EAP, you can call us or whoever your EAP is and say, here's the situation. I want to make this warm transfer to get this person connected to a professional who can assist. While they're talking to that person, I'm going to, call their emergency contact or whatever next steps need to happen if there's an immediate concern about safety. And, go through those steps of getting them connected. So a few resources here that I wanted to go over. Of course, Canopy and if you have us, our information, I'm going to jump to it really quickly. Oops. Right here. So our contact information, if you have us as an EAP, that is our main number. That's the 24/7 number. A counselor answers that. That is a crisis line 24/7, 365. There is also email. That's a little bit, obviously, of course, an email is going to be less urgent. If someone is wanting to text instead of call, they can text 988, and that is a national suicide crisis lifeline. So a person can chat, text, or call that number. So that is available to everyone. That is constantly 24/7 available. So if someone's like, I think I'd just only be comfortable texting right now, that is a really good number to have. And it's a pretty easy one to remember. So that is what that is. So SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Association, a very long acronym. It is an excellent resource. There are tons of resources on there of creating trauma-informed organizations, much more detailed steps and suggestions of supporting employees struggling with mental health. It can also often be potentially related to substance use. There may be circumstances where employees have random drug tests and it's a positive test, and having that conversation with them, getting them connected to resources, and maybe in that conversation they disclose some concerns about mental health or suicidal thoughts. There are so many wonderful resources through SAMHSA's website for individuals, for families, and for organizations. There's NAMI that has an entire website linked to all sorts of community resources. Suicide Prevention Lifeline is another link to, alternative, multiple different ways to communicate with someone immediately. This one can be helpful if you are looking again for resources for someone else. So it can be additional resources for the helper in that moment. I just wanted to provide as many additional resources outside of what EAP can do. A lot of this is, like we were saying, or I was saying, with this presentation, it's kind of a one-way street more so, but I'm keeping an eye on questions in case anything comes up, is really that, we can't fix everything. We can't handle everything alone. So it's starting with knowing where to find your policy, procedure, resources, contact info, know what's available, and kind of have some of those immediate resources on hand of kind of what to say or not say, and then get them connected. This is really a starting point. Again, a lot of this is also just this additional resources slide. Hopefully that is, a good kind of initial overview. I wanted to, again, put our information up here. If you have us as an EAP, that link here is to our member site. And if employees have us as an EAP, they can log into that member site and live chat as well. So I just wanted to provide those resources. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type those into the questions box. Just as a quick reminder, because some folks may have joined a little bit later, we will get the certificates sent out for attending today. So those should get sent out quickly. There is also an optional survey. We always like to get feedback, not only on the training today, but if there are other topics you'd be interested in learning. We always like any and all feedback is wonderful. So I think we will wrap up. I don't see any questions coming through. So we will wrap up for today. And normally we will typically put the recording of these trainings on our YouTube page as well. So if someone's just interested in watching it as an additional resource, you should see that on Canopy's YouTube page in the next week or so. But that is it for today. So I appreciate everyone attending. If you need anything, let us know. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.